Running Sentences presents The Madhouse Job. Part 2. A Twisted Find. Work is not exactly what Jasper thought it was going to be, and things are getting strange as he finds more questions than answers as he explores his job at the mental hospital. This is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, businesses, events, and incidences within this story are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real people, living, dead, and or real events and incidences are purely coincidental. Copyright 2021, Michael Honoré. All rights reserved. With a mop in hand, Jasper had gotten to work cleaning a hallway as directed. It wasn't dirty or anything, but since it had been quiet relatively, Vera had given him a job of just mopping around the hallways in this first building. She had come to find him to see if he needed anything, and to see how he was doing. And she'd come around occasionally to see if he needed anything, which he did not, because all there was to do was mopping. And so he was passing his time noting the nameplates on each of the doors he passed. He worked diligently on the 3rd floor of this building, and then headed down for the 2nd floor, carefully stowing away equipment on this floor's cleaning closet before heading to the next one. The whole time he wasn't thinking much about work, but rather the strange men who'd been led about by the head doctor. He'd lied to Vera about reading about them in the newspaper. No, he didn't know them at all, but they gave him the creeps. There was something off about them, and he didn't want to know what it was. At least not right now. He had more pressing matters to attend to. As he made his way down the stairs, he found himself suddenly pushed to the side by a group of patients coming up the stairs as he was trying to get down them. It was a rather odd sight. He figured most of the patients should be in bed. Yet here they were, 5 of them climbing up the stairs with no one to supervise them and pushing their way around. He stared at them, but they hurried past, and once they disappeared, he continued down the stairs, wondering if he should report the incident or not as he went to the next floor. As he emerged out into a hallway, he looked about for any other superior. It was good to report such things, and he didn't want this to go unreported. But he saw no one, and so he headed down the hallways. As the doors began to bang, this was from the patients on either side of the hallway, banging at their doors. The noise was raucous and annoying. Jasper found himself stopping for a second and looked about to try and gather his wits and figure out what was going on. It had been silent just before this, and now there was all of this happening. He wondered what was going on, as the hallway suddenly filled with security, nurses, and doctors. Then the banging stopped, and Elisa was suddenly by his side. "Come, Mr. Hughes, we have some cleaning to attend to." "Wait, but I just saw a bunch of patients going up to the 3rd floor without an escort." She looked horrified and then grabbed a nearby nurse, and the two rushed off. Stunned by this, Jasper followed back to the staircase. The rush to the 3rd floor left Jasper panting as he hurried to get a few doctors to come help him. When they got up there, though, they found nothing but open doors to the patients' rooms that had been locked. The people who were gathered soon had spread out searching for answers without talking. Jasper stood there trying to figure out what he should do before catching sight of a shirt in one of the doorways. He headed down towards it, his feet hurrying along at a rapid pace as he wanted to know what was going on. Maybe it was a doctor, maybe it was a patient. When he arrived where he figured that scrap of a shirt was, there was nothing to be seen. He moved the door so that he could see the nameplate on it. The name was Douglas Evans, and sent a shudder up and down his body, though he didn't know why. It seemed like an ordinary name, but whatever. Not bothering to stick around and see anymore, he moved to find someone so that he could help out, or someone could help him out. Jasper had found himself in a nearby lounging area that was set up for the patients. It was a simple area, couches, tables, and a few other things to keep one's mind busy from the fact that the windows had bars on them. There were a few people sitting in chairs facing towards a window door that led to an overlook on a balcony. Both looked to be perfectly still. Excuse me, are you two patients?" They didn't respond, and he was soon pushed aside by 2 doctors and nurses who'd come rushing over at the slightest bit of noise. He moved on to see if there was anywhere else he could help, because obviously he wasn't going to help here. Having wandered up and down the hallway looking for anyone else, Jasper found no one, aside from doctors and nurses, that all seemed too busy to pay attention to him. Elisa had disappeared, and so too had the doctors who had been attending to the patients in the lounge. And since there was no one else who was willing to talk to him, or tell him where to go, or search, or maybe that he should be doing some cleaning, he found himself once again in front of the room where he swore he saw at least some form of cloth heading into. It was still semi-open, only the nameplate had changed to read Reed Johnson. Jasper looked at the room number 305 and nodded, though he couldn't remember for the life of him if that was the number he had originally saw. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. A whiff and waft of smoke greeted him upon coming in. It came from a lit cigarette by the window in an ashtray. It was idly burning away unattended to, and Jasper waved away the dark smoke and noticed that Dr. George Bunder was sitting on the bed with a man who was curled up on it. He had a hand around the man's shoulder and looked up. "Oh, Mr. Hughes, good to see you. We need a few new sheets in here for Mr. Nikolai. He's made a mess and gotten spooked by something. If you could..." "Of course, I'll be back in a second, but, the door..." George merely shook his head no, and so Jasper moved to leave the room, but kept his eye on the 2 figures until he was out. Something was definitely off and odd. Having left room 305, Jasper felt his head spinning about with all that was going on. None of this made any sense, yet everyone was acting like it was all going to be okay and that this was normal. What had happened simply just did not compute. He shook his head and headed to a nearby closet and got several new sheets from it. Then, guarding them from the nurses who were also in search of such items, hurried back to the room. When he got back, he found George smoking by the window, sharing a cigarette with the man. A nurse had stripped the bed clean and grabbed the blankets out of his hands. When the bed was remade, the doctor led this Nikolai, back to his bed and helped the man get back to sleep. Jasper stood there for a while watching the whole thing, and then figured he should probably exit since him standing around was not being a very useful worker, and they probably wanted useful workers. So he quietly exited the room, fearing that he was intruding on something, and still trying to get his mind around all that had happened. He'd only gotten a few feet when George came up behind him and pulled him towards a stairwell with a rather concerned look on his face. And once they'd entered this stairwell, George stopped him, and then to make sure that they were all alone. The doctor went so far as to go up a flight of stairs, then down a floor to make sure that there was no one else there. Jasper looked on, confused at what the man was doing. "Mr. Hughes, what did you see tonight?" Jasper gave a quick rundown of what had happened in the previous 20 or so minutes of confusion, though he left out the part about seeing someone enter the room that he'd found the doctor in. "This is happening again? Already?" Excuse me, but what's happening again?" "Oh, there's this old fabled curse that the inmates, or the patients, I should say, like to use to rile up all of the workers. It's nothing really, unless one buys into those stories." Yes, it is a bit much, especially for it to pop up on, it is your first day, I believe. Just ignore it though. Though if you hear anything odd like scratching, do tell me, will you?" Jasper could only look at the man oddly. The thin frame seemed even thinner than before. In fact, the man looked downright gaunt, but he decided not to say anything about what he'd heard so far, and what he'd seen beyond what he'd seen, and what he'd experienced. Yeah, sure, Doc. Please, when we are in private, you can call me George, or when neither of us are working, then you can probably use it at that time as well. No, I do recommend you get back to work before your co-workers start searching for you." Jasper found himself eager to get away from this, and he headed down the stairs as the doctor went back through the door to the 3rd floor. It was another unmistakable sign to him that things were clearly off about this place. Although he had expected it to be weird, this was just too much for his mind. When he opened the door to the second floor from the stairwell, what he saw was a mess. Things were thrown all over the place. Bed sheets, paper sheets, and any items that people could get their hands on was all over the ground. Jasper looked down both ends of the hallway to see that yes, it was all covered, and it was not looking very pretty. With a sigh, he made his way carefully to a nearby cleaning closet to set to work. Inside the closet, he gathered enough materials to help him start on the mess in the hallway, and once he was all set, he moved to exit, only to find that Elisa was in the way. She seemed lost in thought as she stepped aside to let him pass. He looked at her deep in thought and then stopped staring, figuring that he probably had much the same look not that long ago. Hell, he probably still had it as the questions came flooding back to him. There was one thing for sure. He was going to want answers, and he didn't think anyone around here was going to provide any. He stopped at the doorway. Miss Elise, does this place have a library? She looked over. Oh, yes, but most of the books are self-help ones. We don't like the patients to get too heavily into fiction. We find it excites them too much. Oh, is there any other library? Historical. I was looking more for historical items, I think. Across the lake in New West Colchester. It has a small library there. Why? Oh, I just figured I'd find out what my entertainment options are around here. I need to know what I'm going to do on my days off, right? Ah, yes, that would make sense, I see. But you shouldn't go far from the hospital. The town across the lake isn't very friendly. Jasper took this in and didn't give it much thought, other than, of course, someone would say such things. The strange things in the stories that probably came out of this place would only create bad feelings from a nearby town. He rolled his cleaning cart out of the room, thinking of how his day had gone so far, and that it was only a few hours into work. He found himself dreading what the rest of his day might entail. Several hours of work and a mid-shift change, which saw Vera clock out and another worker come on, though he never saw this one, kept things busy. He'd finished cleaning the majority of the hallways, so that it would just need perhaps a sweep through and maybe some washing, but otherwise it would be called clean. He'd taken a break and found a balcony on the mostly empty 5th floor of the building. He settled there for a few minutes, feeling the cold night turn into a cold day, with the sky ever so slightly beginning to bring in some light to the night. Jasper was busy trying to figure out what was up with the place and if his mind could settle on the matter. He'd come here with purpose in mind, but now things were getting odd and his mind loved a good oddity. It always liked mystery, and so, when things were off, it wanted answers. He shook his head. No, his mission was more important, and so was getting in from the cold than this morning. It was far too biting to be out there for more than 15 minutes. Having finished his shift, with nothing else happening, and his busy mind thinking about anything and everything else, Jasper found himself back in the basement of this first building. He was waiting for the tram car, as the intro ward had none ready to whisk him away back to his room. He'd sorted out that the scratching noise was a thing, but what it was, well, it had something to do with the history of this place. Now, why the patients were using this was either a mystery or somebody was organizing something, and that meant that the doctors weren't liked here. Jasper sighed and looked down the tram line to see if any were coming. There were none, and he leaned back and realized that there was a man next to him. I haven't seen your face around here. Are you new? Yes, I'm Jasper Hughes, a new cleaning worker and I guess general maintenance person as well. I see. Well, good luck. The man was a stiff figure who didn't seem to have one bit of him that would be able to slouch even an inch. If one had to guess, it would be that the man was not a man, but rather a stone statue, or at least made out of some sort of the same material. Excuse me, but aren't you the head doctor of this hospital? I only asked because I thought I saw you earlier this evening, showing some people around. Yes, I am Dr. Sebastian Locke. I am the head of this mental institute as both the doctor and operator. This is my project, and I don't want to be questioned by some small little worker. Jasper took a few steps back in surprise. Had he done something that horrible? Was it wrong to ask a few questions? The look on the man's face said nothing, as it was still stone-like, and there was a coldness to it and to his words. The busy hum of a tram pulling into the basement interrupted this. It slowed, then stopped in front of Sebastian, with a rather mean-looking guard at the driver's seat. The head doctor daintily got into the vehicle, and was soon zooming off down the tracks. It took a few more minutes before another one arrived, and he, too, found himself zipping down the line, exhausted and not paying much attention to anything. Having gotten back to his housing quarters that they'd given him to stay at, he'd managed to get up to the door to his room before exhaustion really set in. He stopped at the apartment door and pushed it open, realizing that there was a piece of paper tacked to it. He grabbed at it, pulling it loose as he stepped inside. Upon entering the apartment, he went over to sit on his bed, the piece of paper in his hand unopened. It simply read on the top, Jasper Hughes. He wondered who knew him enough to want to get in contact, and better yet how they knew he was here. Maybe it was a patient, or maybe one of the workers. His hands trembled a bit when he fully opened it. The words, "Got you, M," were written very clearly on it. Jasper flipped the little piece of paper over and over, looking for anything else on it. But aside from his name, all it said was "Got you, M." What was that supposed to mean? His mind refused to think up of anything, as he just one more oddity in a long day of ones. He threw the note onto a nearby, still packed up box, and flopped over to get some sleep. The sight of his old home, the staircase streaked in red, sent shivers down Jasper's spine. It was a sight that had haunted him ever since that day, and now he found himself back here, forced through in his dreams. He tried pinching himself awake, as he knew that he wasn't living through this all again. It didn't work, and as he couldn't control his legs, they began to move up the stairs. Each step was careful to avoid the splotches of red plastered across the stairs and everywhere around. The sight of severed fingers at the top of the stairs greeted him. He knew it well, as it was burned into his mind from when he had come across this originally. Jasper didn't want to, but it was there that he stopped for a second, his eyes finding the half-open door to his parents' bedroom, his feet carrying him towards it with the oddly barren signs of any crimes. He awoke with a start and a clammy cold sweat covering him. The memory of his family home, covered in blood, still rushed about his mind. Jasper shook his head, trying to clear away the thought of it as a heavy knock on the door called to him. He managed to get out of the bedsheets which he'd wrapped himself into at some point during the night, and realized he was still stuck in the maintenance jumper from last night. Feeling a bit icky in it, he thought about taking it off, but another urgent knock on the door pulled him towards that. Jasper grabbed the door and pulled it violently open. He was greeted by two men in rather off-suited suits that didn't seem to fit them. They, however, seemed to ignore this fact, as they both grabbed a hold of him and pulled him out of the door. The two guards had grabbed a hold of either side of his arms, and then turned to head down the hallway. Jasper was confused by all of this, and did his best to try and get their hands off of him, but their grip was way too tight. "Don't struggle, Mr. Hughes. You have a very important meeting to go to." "Meeting? What meeting?" "Locke wants to see you, so we're going to see Locke." Jasper, unable to fight the guards, simply followed along as they took him where they wanted. They'd escorted him all the way to the tram, which took off and then led them to a building which Jasper admitted to himself that he was unsure if he'd been to or not. He figured it was probably the office section of the building where all of the offices were, but he was unsure, and thus when the tram came to a stop, it all looked much nicer than the other places. Everything had a nice gleaming shine to it. Even the basement's hard cement floors looked like they'd been scrubbed so that not a speck of dirt could survive on them. The guards who brought him here paid no attention to any of this, as they led him upstairs into the marble-lined lobby. It was a sight to behold, one that looked like it belonged in a fancy hotel that only the uppermost crust of society, and of cash, ever got to see. He didn't stop here either, though, as he'd now had confirmation that this was some new building he'd never been to before, as the guards kept pulling him along. They escorted him up a fancy set of stairs to the second floor, where they led him off to the side and opened a door, which they led him through. Jasper looked about the subdued waiting room with a secretary sitting at a desk next to a door. It was still a fancy place, but the marble had been replaced by a rich, dark wood, setting a softer feeling. He looked around the space and found that the guards were retreating out the door, but obviously weren't gone. They would still be there. Instead, he turned his attention to the secretary. "Hello, I'm here to see Locke, or, I was told I have an appointment." "You are Mr. Hughes." "Yes, you have a meeting with Locke. It will just be a minute before you are seen." "Sadly, though, you're not much to look at, so I shall look away." Jasper was about to protest, but the secretary didn't look like the type of person who would accept a bit of talk back at them. Everything about her appeared starched and pulled back to an extreme. The only thing about her that didn't have a feeling was her glasses with their cat-eyed shape that was hot red. It didn't suit her look at all, but she seemed not to notice or care, and it was the one thing she had, and so he stood there watching her as she pressed the button next to her desk. "Mr. Hughes, to see you." When she took her finger off of the buzzer button, she waved her hand at him to go to the door. He went over with haste, not wanting to get on the bad side of his secretary. He entered this office and looked about for Dr. Sebastian Locke among the rich mahogany bookcases and desk. Even the rug, which had a very plush look and feel to it, felt like he could feel it through his tough boots. What did greet him, by the way of cigarette smoke and an alluring light casting shadows everywhere, was a woman sitting on top of her desk, staring at him. "Come in, Mr. Hughes. I see you're surprised that I'm not my father. I am Johanna Locke, and I am a psychiatrist for all the workers here at the hospital." She did a little hop to get off of her desk, and she casually strolled over to him. He noted her pantsuit, which seemed tailored to every bit of her, and did her body credit. There was no doubt that she was, and is, an attractive woman. She offered her hand, which he took and shook, though still trying to figure out what this was all about. She seemed to catch on instantly and pointed towards a balcony. "Perhaps we can talk outside on the balcony. It's nice out today, and you can actually see a few things from the view on the balcony." She, having already decided that this was a good idea, headed straight for it without consulting him further. He, on the other hand, decided that following a woman with a nice butt onto a balcony sounded okay to him. That is, as long as she didn't try anything, like throwing him off of it. A thought that fluttered through his mind with all of the oddity that had happened recently. He was greeted by the clear sight lines of at least 4 buildings with walkways between them when he reached outside, all set to an idyllic-looking lawn with a few trees here and there. It was a very different sight from the one he was used to peering out in the woods from his balcony. "This looks very different from the normal sight line I have." "Yes, it is. The only people who get this sight are a few doctors and the families of patients. The rest is a dull life of plodding about hallways working." "I see. Now why am I here?" "We like to keep track of all the people working here to make sure that they're all right. Working in a mental hospital is tough, and it's my job to make sure that you're doing okay. And I heard from George Bunder that you were in the thick of it last night in an incident. Are you interested in talking about what happened or what occurred? None of what you say, by the way, will, of course, leave this room. It is all strictly between us." Jasper offered a shrug to her. "Patients acted up, then some disappeared, then everything was okay again. Not much to talk about." "So, do you believe the old story about this place? That it has some terrible past and scratching is something or something?" "No idea. I don't know the story, really, and no one seems to want to tell me. Oddly enough, it's the same for me, Mr. Hughes. You ask and ask everyone, including I've asked my father, and it just all simply gets pushed off to the side, with no answers. I see. Well, it's nice to meet you and all that, but I would like to get something to eat before I have to hurry and get back to work again. As you wish, sir. I'll see you around, and if anything comes up, and you have anything you need to talk about, please do come talk to me. Jasper moved towards the balcony door and then stopped. Do you mean, like, the odd nightmares and hearing things, or, just general hospital work? She looked over at him curiously. Whatever is troubling you, my job is to make sure you don't end up as a patient. Does that happen? Well, not as far as I know, but, there is always the potential for it, and we don't want that. He shrugged and opened the door to the office and stepped through. Jasper soon found himself back on the tram headed for the housing unit where he was staying. His mind was awash with thoughts. Mythlock and George talked to one another, but also didn't because she said no one would tell her the story of what this place was. That is, if she was telling the truth, and so far, no one had given him a reason to trust them. And he had to worry about his original reason for being here in the first place. He really needed to make time to find out about Port. The tram slowed as it arrived at the housing unit basement. Jasper had eventually found himself into the patient's cafeteria, eating alone at a table, and was carefully looking over everyone. But the one he wanted to see wasn't there, and it was bothering him. Patients came and went about, but none of them were Port, and the man was supposed to be at this hospital. He was supposed to be newly checked in as well, and none of it made any sense to Jasper as time was ticking ever closer to when he would need to head over to check in for work. Not wanting to be late on his second day, Jasper got up after one more look around and hurried to get to the office. At the maintenance office, he found Reginald stamping papers with a stamp and then passing them from one box to the next. The man repeated the process until the box of papers was empty, then repeating the process, only backwards. Sir, I'm checking in to work for the day. Reginald half pointed towards the wall on his right, where a check-in clock stood with plenty of punch cards. Jasper wandered over to it and took out the card with his name on it and made sure that all of the essential information was right, before then stamping it and putting it back into its spot. He turned to leave, but then was stopped. Oh, it is you, Mr. Hughes. We never set a schedule for you, did we? You need to have days off since it is regulated by the great Mr. Locke that we do so. He doesn't want his workers to becoming inmates of the asylum. So what day is it again? Tuesday, or what's left of Tuesday anyway. Well, I think you will have Wednesdays and Thursdays off. So once you are off this shift tomorrow morning, you'll be free until Friday evening. Okay? Yeah, that's fine by me. Good. Now get to work and don't let me hear of anything bad happening to you or to any of the inmates. Reginald waved him away, and Jasper scurried out, worried that something odd was about to happen. The shift went surprisingly well, in that nothing really happened. He cleaned here and there, fixed a few things, and generally helped out where he could. The shift was entirely uneventful, and then he was free for 2 days. He found himself wandering away from the office building, where he had just checked out, and found himself outside walking in the early morning sun, on the back paths that weren't visible to most of the buildings, as they were crowded and covered by shrubberies. He found himself back before the housing unit building where they were making him stay, and he stared at it. It was a nice building, although crawling with ivy along the old bricks, it sort of lost all of its looks. The place gave the place an old Victorian feel, and a bit pompous in sort of the same way one looks at an old college building. As Jasper continued his journey, he swore he could hear the faintest of noise ahead of him, but just ahead and to the other side of the shrubbery. But every time he tried to find a spot that he could try and look through the shrubbery, it proved to be too thick, and so he found himself moving along, trying to hear this noise and see what was on the other side. He found himself chasing the noise down a hidden pathway. It was staying just a few feet in front of him, but always present. Finally, the path had a small break in it, not far away, but as he approached it, the noise dropped. And then, once he was able to get around the shrubbery and finally look around, he found himself at the edge of the woods with no one in sight. The nearest building of the hospital was a ways away. There was no people, and he could clearly see from the edge of the woods to the buildings as it was just a grassy lawn that stretched out in front of him. Plus, there was the shrubbery, which he wondered if someone had gotten through. Jasper quickly stepped back onto the straight pathway to see if there was anything there, but there was none. With a shake of his head, he wondered if this place was just getting to him, as he made his way back toward where they'd housed him. Exhausted, and unable to think much before arriving back at his little hovel of an apartment or dorm room, whichever one wanted to call it, that they'd given to him to use, he found his way to his bed and undressed from the coveralls, and then flopped onto the bed, too tired to think of much other than praying that no nightmares tonight, please, as he drifted off. When he awoke, Jasper stretched, and for the first time in a while felt rather refreshed. He rolled out of bed with a plan in mind, and quickly got dressed so that he could get off the island for at least a little while to clear his mind. He'd managed to find his way back to his car, and was making his way towards it, failing to notice that he was being followed. He'd gotten his key into the car door to unlock it. "Are you going somewhere, Mr. Hughes?" Jasper jumped and spun about to see Johanna standing not far from him. She looked curious, with her head tilted slightly to the side, and another amazing outfit on her. "Jeez. Apologies, I didn't expect you not to notice me, since I was so loudly walking behind you, and even called out to you at least once." "You did? I'm sorry, I didn't notice. I've been so caught up in my mind that, well..." "Yes, I did. Are you leaving?" Yes, it's my day off, 2 days off, so I wanted to travel about a bit and maybe visit the mainland and see if there was anything interesting there." "I take it from our conversation the other day that you're going to be looking into the history of this place, aren't you?" No. "Well, that's too bad. And also, I don't believe you. But since you are leaving, I'm coming with you." What? Wait, what?" She, however, came around to the passenger side of his car and opened the door and got in. Jasper cursed to himself for either forgetting to lock the doors or letting the weird hospital people get his stuff out of the car and not lock the doors. Either way, the door should not have been unlocked. With a sigh, he got in. He drove off of the campus of the hospital and got his car pointed towards the little town that also occupied the island. It was the only thing that the road pointed towards, but it still felt better to think of it this way as he drove. They drove in silence, the scenic view of crowded trees along the road, giving them their only thing to view at as they drove. It took a much shorter amount of time than Jasper expected to get to town than he thought it would, and in fact they were through the town in just as quickly. He could have sworn that it took longer to get there, but the mostly abandoned town was here and then gone, and so he concentrated on the road in front of him. And even more shockingly, the trip was short to the docks, where the ferry would land to get them across. But it wasn't in port when they arrived. Jasper convinced himself that it was because he drove slowly the first time, and because he was unsure of himself and the roads. He stepped out of his car to get out and stretch and get away from thoughts, and Johanna followed suit. There was an uncomfortable silence between them as he tried to figure out what was going on. Why was she tailing him? "Miss Locke." "You can call me Johanna." "Miss Locke, why did you get into my car?" "I told you, I want to discover things just like you do." "And that's all?" "You did look a bit like a lost soul as well. Something is troubling you, and it is my job to help those that are lost. And I don't want one of our mental hospital employees turning into a source of problems. This little trip might help me help you out, or not. We shall find out, I suppose." "I don't trust you." "And why don't you?" He merely looked over at her with a look that told her that he wasn't about to divulge that, because it should be obvious. The noise of a ferry chugging its way along came into sight from around the bend of the inlet that the dock stood on. The burly, flat boat tugged its way slowly through the passageway, and then came to a slow bumping stop in the slipway. When all of this was done, the gangplank lowered to reveal that no other car or person was aboard, aside from the helmsman or captain, or whatever the man waving them aboard called himself. Jasper got back into his car and moved it into position to get onto the ferry, and he got it aboard. Johanna, on the other hand, stayed out of the car and walked aboard on her own. Jasper had stayed in his car as the journey across the lake took place. It was nice and clear out there on the water, but he wanted to be away from Johanna, who seemed to be up to something. What he could not say and did not know, but it was something, and it only added problems and mysteries to what lay in front of him. He decided he would have to be careful no matter what happened. Eventually, the ferry barge bumped its way into the docks for the town across the lake an hour later. Colchester was not much of a place to look at, with few nearby buildings that were near the dock area. The library stood out like a sore thumb next to the town hall, and Joanna had gotten back into the car as Jasper was slowly easing it off to the barge. "Do you want to go to the library to see what you can find out about the history of this place?" "Yes, please. Will you be joining me?" "No, I have something to do. A friend contacted me and I need to get in touch in private, if you don't mind." "As you wish, but if I learn anything, I'm not telling you anything about it." He shook his head as the car cleared the last gap and had all of its tires now firmly on land again. Jasper found himself driving the short distance of a few hundred feet from the dock to the front of the library and came to a stop in front of the old structure. It was wooden and brick, and it did not look happy to be still standing. He looked over at Johanna, who seemed a bit troubled as she looked at the building, and then at him. She offered a weak smile, though her brow was furrowed, and with a sigh got out of the car. He watched her as she came around the front of the car and looked both ways before crossing the street, and then headed into the library itself. He sat there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what he wanted to do, as he didn't actually have a meeting with anyone, and he'd specifically come here to go to the library. But now he gunned the engine and turned the wheel. At the very least, he could hit the road and think. Having made it a few miles down the road, traveling at a good clip when he saw a sign for a diner to which his stomach decided to rumble at. And so he found the spot to pull off in so that he could park at this diner's parking lot. It was a place that called itself the original Colchester Diner, and was more of a metal tube that looked like a classic train diner than a restaurant, an unoriginal name for a place. But the thought of the food was more pressing matter in his mind than was already abuzz with so many thoughts. So he soon found himself sitting in a booth with a cup of soda, a weird named soda called birch beer, and nothing to do but stare out the window at the setting sun and the lake view that stretched out before him. "Are you Mr. Jasper Hughes?" Jasper jumped and turned to find a very rough-looking waiter and probably cook standing next to his booth. Yes. "There is a phone call for you from the phone booth." Jasper looked around for a second but didn't spot anything and was puzzled. The waiter/cook pointed off towards a phone booth that looked like it was ready to fall apart in the corner of the small trailer diner. Then they departed, heading back to their work to tend to people, though there were only a few other people in the establishment, and both of them were at the counter. He hazarded a guess that neither of these people had moved from their spots in a long time, and were fixtures as much as the chairs they sat on. He slid out of the booth to see what was going on. Once he got over to the phone booth, as much as one could call it that, then got in as much as he possibly could, or as he could say that one could get into, to find himself trying to squeeze in. but half the booth seemed to have fallen mostly over, while the part with the phone remained firmly rooted in place. Jasper found himself reaching around to grab the phone and pull it out of the maze to put it to his ear. "Hello, this is Jasper Hughes. Who is calling for me?" "Mr. Hughes, Chris Newell, a reporter for the Record, and I'm hoping to talk to you about things." "Well, you're talking to me right now, but, tell me how you found me." "Where would you go if you wanted to get close to the man who was sentenced to a mental hospital? Of course, you'd be in the area trying to understand what's happened and why. I called around the past several days to get you, and I will explain more, but don't do anything." Why? And, the man Port is innocent. There is no way that he could have been the one who did the murdering. Now please, just wait there until I get there. I will explain it all." The line fell dead with a busy signal, and Jasper took the phone away from his ear to look at the receiver for a second. A sneaking feeling that the man had either hung up or had been cut off came to him, so he put the phone back to his ear. There was no more tone on it, and so he slid the phone back into its place. As he turned to head back to his table and stopped for a second, a new person was sitting at the counter and looked weird and off, like they didn't belong there. He started walking again, just to get past this person, but he couldn't help shake that something was off. The thin weed of a man stood as he walked past him and followed him towards his booth. Jasper sat down and then looked over at the man who was standing next to the booth, in a set of dead eyes that looked very similar to the man Port. "Can I help you, sir?" "You work at the mental hospital?" "Yes, what of it?" "Then you can help." As the man slunk his way towards the other side to sit down, Johanna burst into the diner. She spotted him and came hurrying over. "Jasper, we need to talk." "I was about to have a talk with this man." They both turned to look at where the man was, but he was no longer there. This caused Jasper to glance around and even stood up, as Johanna also joined him in looking around. "I did see him, but, he's, gone?" "Yeah." When it was clear that the man was indeed gone and showed no sign of returning, she turned back to Jasper and pulled his arm. "We should go." "I haven't eaten anything since late this morning." She looked troubled and then went over and sat down on the other side of the booth from where he'd been seated. Johanna looked about carefully as she did, expecting something to happen, but nothing did. He lowered himself back into the booth, stomach still grumbling. "Who was that man, by the way?" "I don't know. He looked like a person I know, but, or I knew. I think I knew. No, but I don't know them. No. Now, what would you say this news is?" "The hospital we work at should not be there." Okay. What do you mean?" "I shall start with the history of the place. The island was bought by Hewitt Tyler in 1866, very cheaply. It was an unoccupied place, and he built a giant house on it. There were several more houses, all connected, built near one another. The hospitals. I don't know if they were or were not the same ones, but it is my suspicion that yes, all of the buildings that we see were once, at least, part of a great house. Anyway, he built the town on the island, and people came there for a quiet, idyllic life. It became a retreat for the sick, and then Mr. Tyler turned this place into a hospital, since he was making money off of it all." "But there's a mine there, isn't there? I mean..." "Yes and no, apparently. There was once an attempt at a mine, but that was quickly shot down. Anyway. Then the worst thing ever strikes and the island, sort of vanishes, or should have vanished. Well, it was not the worst thing ever, but Mr. Tyler one night goes to his study and locks the door. There is no way in or out of the room other than that door. The morning comes around, and his secretary, who guarded his door all night, knocked. And then, when there was no answer, got a guard to manage to knock the door handle loose, and they entered. But the man, Tyler Hewitt, was nowhere to be seen." Jasper sat back to consider this. It sounded a lot like a fictional story, something made up to appease the masses about someone vanishing. It sounds familiar, cliché, silly. Johanna pulled a book out of her purse and pushed it across to him. He had only to look at the title and author to feel in his senses that it was all wrong. All very wrong. The Truth of the Old Mental Hospital by Chris Newell and Vera Langsong. A journalist and a nurse wrote this. It was published 3 years ago. Nurse? I think I know that name as a maintenance worker, and this journalist is supposedly coming to see me. His finger emphatically pointed towards both names. Then a motion at the counter drew their attention as the cook or waiter or whatever came around with 2 plates. Johanna quickly snatched the book off of the table and back into her purse. A minute later, the cook was in front of them and dropped off 2 plates with burgers and greasy-looking fries. The cook eyed them and then looked like he wanted to say something, but stopped and then took a step away. If you 2 are digging into the past, don't do it in my establishment. I don't want the ghost coming for me from the other side. Then the cook headed back towards the kitchen behind the counter and vanished into the interior. Jasper, who'd watched the man, turned back around to find Johanna ravenously attacking her food. He raised an eyebrow. You seem very hungry. She shrugged, and he started to pick at his fries until she had gulped down some of his soda and cleared her throat. From what I know, she was a nurse, and then there was an incident. But because of the rules and regulations, I can't share what she told me or why she made the switch. Wait, none of this explains why the hospital shouldn't exist. I'll write that bit. It was scheduled to be demolished. They were going to sink the whole island because they wanted to see what would happen. Some of the engineer corps, or whatever they were called. Or maybe it was the local college. Anyway, the day it was to happen, the lead professor or the Army Corps engineer, or maybe both of them, or I don't know. The book wasn't very clear on that, or I didn't read too much into it. They went around, checked to make sure everything was all right. They were last seen headed towards the old study of Mr. Tyler's. The crew that was ready to do the experiment, so they waited a few hours and then went to check. They headed up towards the study, and they found the words scratched into the door of the study. Don't do it. The island must live. End of part 2. Thank you for listening.